The camera clicks on with a jolt, the frame shaking as a hand adjusts the focus. At first, it's just darkness, the faint rustling of movement, the sound of breathing, quick, uneven. Then slowly, an image begins to take shape. A dimly lit room, a single chair in the center, and a person standing just beyond the reach of the light, their features blurred in the shadows. No one was ever supposed to see this footage. The story begins in the fall of 1994, when a dusty VHS tape was found inside an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The house had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, its doors locked from the outside. No one could remember the last time anyone had lived there. Some said that owners had left in the middle of the night, their belongings still inside, never to return. Others claimed something much worse had happened, something no one wanted to talk about. For decades, the house remained untouched, a relic of the past. That is, until a group of friends stumbled upon it while filming for their small YouTube channel. Urban exploration was their thing. Abandoned buildings, lost places, forgotten stories. They had been to dozens of places just like this before. But this time something felt different. The moment they stepped inside, the air was thick with dust and silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor littered with broken glass and old newspapers, their pages yellow with age. They moved cautiously, their flashlights sweeping over furniture that looked like it had been frozen in time. And then, in the back of the house, they found it. A small wooden chest, half buried under debris. The lock was broken, the hinges rusted. Inside, a collection of old videotapes, neatly stacked, each labeled with a date. The earliest from the late 80s, the most recent from the early 2000s. They had no idea what they were about to uncover. Later that night, back at their apartment, they dusted off an old VCR and inserted the first tape. The screen flickered with static before an image appeared. A darkened room, a flickering light bulb swinging from the ceiling. The camera was handheld, shaky, moving as if the person holding it was in a hurry. And then, a voice. "You shouldn't be watching this." The voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. The camera panned slowly, revealing a figure standing against the far wall. A woman, barefoot, wearing a dress that looked wrinkled and worn. Her face was partially obscured by her hair, but there was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that sent the chill down their spines. Then she took a step forward. "I don't have much time," she said, her voice trembling. "But if someone finds this, don't look for me." The screen cut to black. The room was silent. The group exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what they had just watched. The date on the tape was from 1989. No one had lived in that house since then. One of them reached for the next tape. Despite every instinct screaming at them to stop, they knew they wouldn't. They had already gone too far. And the real nightmare was only just beginning. One of them reached for the next tape. No one said a word. The room felt different now, heavier, as if the silence itself had weight. The TV screen had gone dark, the glow from the VCR's display still flickered in the dimly lit apartment. The air was thick with something unspoken. Hesitation, fear, maybe even regret. But none of them stopped. Curiosity had already taken hold. The second tape slid into the player with a soft click. Static filled the screen again, lines of distortion rolling up and down before the image appeared. Another dimly lit room. Another shaky frame. But this time, the camera wasn't still. It moved through a hallway slow and unsteady, as if the person holding it was afraid of what they might find. The audio crackled. Footsteps. Breathing. The distant hum of something mechanical. And then, a door. The person behind the camera hesitated, the frame shifting slightly as if they were debating whether to go inside. For a moment, nothing happened. Just the sound of the camera's faint whirring. Then a hand reached out. The door creaked open. The room beyond was almost identical to the first one. A single chair in the center. A bare bolt hanging from the ceiling, its weak light casting long shadows against the walls. But this time, the chair wasn't empty. A man sat there, his head tilted downward, his hands resting in his lap. His face wasn't visible, but his posture was eerily still, too still. The camera moved closer, slow and careful. Static crackled through the speakers, distorting the image for a second. When it cleared, the man had shifted. His head was now slightly raised, as if he had heard something. But he still didn't move. Then, the screen cut to black. Mark leaned forward, grabbing the remote to rewind again, pausing frame by frame. The static distorted the image in patches. But then, it was there. A still shot. A closer view of the man in the chair, but this time his head was up. His eyes were open, and he was looking directly at the camera. No body, no trace, just a handful of takes that no one could ever explain. Lena looked back at the TV, the static still buzzing faintly through the speakers. Mark spoke first. There are more tapes. No one wanted to say it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. Daniel Hensley had gone looking for something, and whatever it was, he had found it. Now, they had found it too. And maybe, just maybe, it had found them back. Josh turned off the TV, but static cut out, leaving the room in silence, but it didn't make anything feel better. The tapes sat on the coffee table, stacked neatly, untouched except for the three they had already watched. Mark drummed his fingers against his leg, his mind racing. None of them had spoken in the last few minutes, not really. It was as if saying anything out loud would make it more real. Lena was still staring at her phone, rereading the article about Daniel Hensley. His face on the screen was the same one they had seen in the footage. The same tired eyes, the same desperate expression. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had recorded those tapes knowing he wouldn't be able to finish his investigation. Knowing that someone or something would stop him. Josh finally broke the silence. Okay, so what now? Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together. I don't know, but we can't just leave it here. Lena shook her head. You saw what he said. You need to stop. Maybe we should actually listen. Mark gave a dry laugh. You think that's going to help? Whatever this is, it's not over just because we turn off the TV. Lena hesitated. He was right, and she hated that. Something about those tapes felt unfinished. They had watched 3, but there were at least a dozen more. Josh leaned back against the couch, his jaw tight. What if someone else is still involved? I mean, someone had to have left those tapes there. They didn't just appear. That was the worst part of all of this. The idea that someone, not just Daniel Hensley, but someone else, had been recording. Someone had been watching. Mark stood up and started pacing. I think we need to go back. Josh and Lena both snapped their heads toward him. Are you serious? Lena asked. Mark nodded. There's got to be more in that house. Something we missed. If we just left the tapes there, someone else would have found them eventually, right? We already opened the door. The room was silent. This has to be some kind of prank, Josh said, but his voice lacked confidence. Maybe one of those weird art projects or something. No one's lived in that house for years, Lena said. Who would have left this? Josh shrugged, but he didn't have an answer. None of them did. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. All right, just one more. He reached for the next tape. The others exchanged glances, but no one protested. They were already in too deep. The third tape started the same way, static, distortion, then a dimly lit room. But this time something was different. The quality of the footage was slightly better, the colors sharper. It looked newer. The camera was pointed at a desk. Papers were scattered across it, handwritten notes, maps, old photographs. A voice spoke, soft, urgent. If you found this, the camera moved, showing a man's face. He looked tired, unshaven. His eyes darted back and forth, as if checking the shadows around him. You need to stop. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This doesn't end the way you think it will. The screen glitched again. The image cut to something else. A hallway, dimly lit, walls covered in peeling wallpaper. A familiar house. The same house. But now there were signs of life. Footsteps. Movement in the shadows. Someone was still there. Then a voice. A whisper, barely audible. Don't follow me? The screen cut to black. The group sat frozen. The air in the apartment felt colder now, like the heat had drained out of the room. Lena reached for her phone, scrolling through old articles, local news archives. Something about the house had to be documented somewhere. A crime. A disappearance. Anything? And then she found it. An article from 1995. The headline, Asterisk asterisk local journalist missing after investigating abandoned property. Asterisk asterisk. Below it, a photograph. The same man from the tape. The one who had looked into the camera and warned them to stop. Lena's stomach dropped. Mark and Josh leaned in, reading over her shoulder. The article was short, a brief mention of a man named Daniel Hensley, a freelance journalist who had been researching an urban legend connected to the house. He had told friends he was close to uncovering something that he had footage proving his theory. Then, one night, he disappeared. Mark nodded. There's gotta be more in that house. Something we missed. If we just left the tapes there, someone else would have found them eventually, right? We already opened the door. Lena didn't like this. None of it. But Mark had a point. The way things were going, they wouldn't be able to just pretend this never happened. Josh ran a hand over his face. Fine. But we go in, look around, and leave. No messing around. The three of them packed up their gear, flashlights, cameras, extra batteries. It was a bad idea. They all knew it. But something about those tapes wouldn't let them walk away. The drive back to the house was quiet. The streets were empty, the town asleep. The house sat at the end of a long, cracked road, its windows dark, its presence looming. The second they pulled up, Lena felt the same unease settle in her stomach. Inside, the air was colder than before, stale and heavy. Their footsteps echoed against the warped floorboards. The wooden chest where they had found the tapes was still open, its contents disturbed. Lena ran her flashlight along the walls. What exactly are we looking for? Mark walked toward the hallway. Anything. Something that connects all this. His car was found a few blocks away, engine still running. The door was open. His belongings were still inside. But Daniel was never seen again. No body. No trace. Just a handful of tapes that no one could ever explain. Lena looked back at the TV, the static still buzzing faintly through the speakers. Mark spoke first. There are more tapes. No one wanted to say it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. Daniel Hensley had gone looking for something. And whatever it was, he had found it. Now they had found it too. And maybe, just maybe, it had found them back. Josh turned off the TV. The static cut out, leaving the room in silence, but it didn't make anything feel better. The tapes sat on the coffee table stacked neatly, untouched except for the three they had already watched. Mark drummed his fingers against his leg, his mind racing. None of them had spoken in the last few minutes, not really. It was as if saying anything out loud would make it more real. Lena was still staring at her phone, rereading the article about Daniel Hensley. His face on the screen was the same one they had seen in the footage. The same tired eyes, the same desperate expression. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had recorded those tapes knowing he wouldn't be able to finish his investigation. Knowing that someone or something would stop him. Josh finally broke the silence. Okay, so what now? Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together. I don't know, but we can't just leave it here. Lena shook her head. You saw what he said. You need to stop. Maybe we should actually listen. Mark gave a dry laugh. You think that's gonna help? Whatever this is, it's not over just because we turn off the TV. Lena hesitated. He was right, and she hated that. Something about those tapes felt unfinished. They had watched 3, but there were at least a dozen more. Josh leaned back against the couch, his jaw tight. What if someone else is still involved? I mean, someone had to have left those tapes there. They didn't just appear. That was the worst part of all of this. The idea that someone, not just Daniel Hensley, but someone else, had been recording. Someone had been watching. Mark stood up and started pacing. I think we need to go back. Josh and Lena both snapped their heads toward him. Are you serious? Lena asked. Josh was quieter than before. He kept glancing behind them like he expected someone to be there. The house had more rooms than they had explored last time. They moved carefully, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The hallway stretched longer than it had before, or maybe it just felt that way. Then Lena saw it. A door at the end of the hall. It had been slightly open before, but now it was closed. She swallowed hard and stepped toward it. The others followed, their footsteps slowing. Mark reached out first, placing his hand against the wood. It felt cold damp. Then he pushed. The door groaned as it swung inward. The room beyond was small, bare walls. A wooden desk, a chair, and a single camera, old and dust-covered, sitting in the corner on a tripod. Lena's heart pounded. Someone had set this up. Josh stepped closer, reaching for the camera. The dust crumbled under his touch. With the red light on the side was blinking. Still recording. His breath caught. Guys, this thing is on. Mark grabbed his own camera and started filming. Lena felt her hand shake as she aimed her flashlight at the desk. A notebook lay open, its pages filled with hurried, messy handwriting. She read the words out loud. They watch when you watch. The room was silent. Josh let go of the camera as if it had burned him. Mark aimed his flashlight at the desk, scanning the rest of the writing. There were names written over and over, some crossed out, others underlined. Daniel Hensley's name was there. So was another name, one that hadn't been in the articles. Lena pointed at it. Who's this? Josh pulled out his phone and started searching. The name led to nothing. No missing persons. No news reports. Just nothing. Mark exhaled. I don't think we should be here. Then the sound. A slow, deliberate creak from somewhere down the hall. Josh turned toward the doorway, his flashlight shaking. That was the wind, right? No one answered. Then, another sound. A footstep. Not theirs. Lena felt her stomach drop. We need to leave. Mark nodded. Now. They turned and moved quickly back down the hall, their steps faster, their breath coming in short bursts. The house felt different now, heavier, like something was pressing in on them. Then, as they reached the front door, Josh stopped. His voice was barely above a whisper. Wait, look. Lena turned, her breath catching. The door they had just come from, the one leading to the room with the camera, it was closed, shut tight. But none of them had touched it. Lena stared at the tape in her hands, her fingers gripping the edges so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The date scrawled across the label, 2 weeks ago, felt impossible. But there it was, written in ink that hadn't faded, on a tape that hadn't gathered dust like the others. The weight of it sent a shiver through her, as if she were holding proof of something she didn't want to believe. Mark and Josh were silent, their breathing the only sound in the car. The world outside felt too still, as if everything beyond the windshield was waiting for them to acknowledge what they had found. Josh exhaled sharply. We didn't take this from the house. Linda nodded, still staring at the tape. No, it wasn't there before. Mark reached out and took it from her, turning it over in his hands. Then where the hell did it come from? No one had an answer. The parking lot around them was empty, but Lena suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to check. She turned in her seat, her eyes scanning the darkened street, the dim glow of the distant streetlights. Nothing moved. No cars, no people. Just the eerie stillness of a town that should have felt familiar, but now seemed different. Josh rubbed his hands over his face. We can't just sit here. We need to know what's on it. Lena hesitated. Every instinct in her screamed that watching it was the last thing they should do. But deep down she knew they would. They had come this far. Mark grabbed his backpack from the backseat, pulling out the small portable VHS player they had used earlier. He flipped it open, his movements quick and anxious, as if getting through this park faster would make it less terrifying. Lena swallowed hard. We should go somewhere safe. Josh nodded. Not my place, not after. He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what he meant. They had already brought too much of this back with him. Mark looked up. Motel. Somewhere random. Lena didn't argue. The less connected to them, the better. Mark started the car again, pulling out of the lot, keeping his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. The drive was quiet. Every so often, Josh turned to check the backseat, as if expecting someone or something to be there. 20 minutes later, they pulled into a rundown motel off the highway. A flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow onto the pavement. The place was nearly empty, save for one car parked near the office. The night clerk barely looked at them as Mark paid in cash, handing over a single key before going back to whatever ancient radio show was playing behind the counter. The room was small, the air thick with the scent of old carpet and cheap cleaning products. The walls were lined with outdated wallpaper, kind that looked like it had once been cheerful but had long since faded into something lifeless. Mark set the VHS player on the desk, plugging it into the ancient TV mounted to the wall. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in a dull blue glow. Linda sat on the edge of the bed, watching as Mark slid the tape in, the machine whirred, swallowing it whole. Then the screen went black. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the static started. Not like before. This wasn't just a random blur of white noise. It pulsed, the sound uneven, like something was trying to break through. Then an image. A hallway. Lena's stomach twisted. It was the house. The same warped floorboards, the same peeling wallpaper. The camera was shaky. Whoever was holding it moving slowly, deliberately. Then the camera turned. A door. Lena sucked in a breath. It was the same one, the door that had shut on its own. The person behind the camera reached out. Their fingers were pale, trembling. They grabbed the doorknob, turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the darkened room inside. A desk, a chair. The camera moved further inside, slow, cautious. Then, the red light. Lena's breath hitched. The camera in the room, the one they had seen earlier, was on, recording. The person holding the camera hesitated, then stepped closer. Then, the screen flickered. The image distorted, static crackling through the audio. For a second, just a second, something flashed across the screen. A figure. Mark set the VHS player on the desk, plugging it into the ancient TV mounted to the wall. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in a dull blue glow. Linda sat on the edge of the bed, watching as Mark slid the tape in, the machine whirred, swallowing it whole. Then the screen went black. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the static started. Not like before. This wasn't just a random blur of white noise. It pulsed, the sound uneven, like something was trying to break through. Then an image. A hallway. Lena's stomach twisted. It was the house. The same warped floorboards, the same peeling wallpaper. The camera was shaky, whoever was holding it moving slowly, deliberately. Then the camera turned. A door. Lena sucked in a breath. It was the same one, the door that had shut on its own. The person behind the camera reached out. Their fingers were pale, trembling. They grabbed the doorknob, turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the darkened room inside. A desk, a chair. The camera moved further inside, slow, cautious. Then the red light. Lena's breath hitched. The camera in the room, the one they had seen earlier, was on, recording. The person holding the camera hesitated, then stepped closer. Then the screen flickered. The image distorted, static crackling through the audio. For a second, just a second, something flashed across the screen. A figure. Too fast to make out clearly. Then the tape jumped forward. The hallway again, but this time something was different. The walls were wrong. The wallpaper looked newer. The floorboards weren't as warped. It wasn't just a different angle, it was a different time. Josh leaned forward. Wait. Then the voice. Faint, muffled. A man's voice whispering. But it wasn't coming from the TV. It was coming from inside the room. Lena's blood ran cold. She turned her head slowly, her breath caught in her throat. The closet door. Closed when they had come in. Now slightly open. A sliver of darkness beyond it. Then the whisper again. Closer. The TV screen flickered violently, the static rising, distorting the image. Josh shot to his feet, knocking over the chair. Turn it off. Mark reached for the player, but the second his fingers touched it, the screen cut to black. Silence. For a moment, no one moved. Lena's heart pounded against her ribs, her ears straining in the heavy, suffocating quiet. Then, the closet door creaked open another inch, and something moved inside. Lena's entire body tensed as the closet door creaked open another inch. The air in the motel room felt thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. Josh was frozen near the overturned chair, his eyes wide, locked on the dark gap in the closet. Mark's hand hovered over the VHS player, his fingers curled in hesitation, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Then the whisper came again, closer this time, more distinct. You found it. Lena felt something cold rush through her veins. It was the same voice from the car radio, the same layered, distorted sound, like more than one person speaking at once. The closet door moved again. This time it didn't creak. It swung open fast, like something had pushed it. Lena barely had time to react before Mark grabbed her arm, yanking her backward as Josh scrambled away from the closet. The inside was pitch black, darker than it should have been. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was like the space itself wasn't normal, wasn't part of the room at all. Except for one thing. One last frame before the screen went black. A hallway. The same hallway from the house. And at the end of it, a door. A door with their names carved into the wood. The tape ejected itself, clattering onto the motel floor. No one moved. Then, Mark grabbed the tape and stood up, his face pale. We're ending this. Lena swallowed hard. How? Mark looked at her, then at Josh. We go back. Lena didn't want to go back. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to forget they ever found the tapes, to leave whatever was waiting for them in that house behind. But deep down, she knew Mark was right. If they didn't end this, they wouldn't stop. The tapes had found their way to them for a reason. Whatever force had been pulling them in wasn't going to let go until they faced it. Josh sat on the edge of the bed, his hands running through his hair. This is insane. What if we go back and we don't come out? Mark tightened his grip on the tape. Then we make sure that doesn't happen. The ride back to the house was silent. The highway stretched out ahead of them, endless and empty, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The further they drove, the more it felt like they were slipping into something beyond their control, like the world outside was fading away and only the house. Only the truth remained. When they finally pulled up to the property, it looked the same as before. Abandoned, lifeless. But now it didn't just feel eerie. It felt aware, as if it had been waiting for them to return. And then something stepped forward. It wasn't a person. It was something else. The figure was tall, its body obscured by shadows, its features blurred like a distorted image on an old television screen. Its presence made the room feel wrong, the air buzzing with static, the hairs on Lena's arms standing on end. Josh let out a strangled gasp. Mark pressed himself against the wall, his hands clenched into fists. The figure took another step, the shape of it shifting unnaturally, like it was flickering in and out of existence. The motel lights dimmed, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Lena's mind raced. This wasn't just about the tapes. This wasn't just some ghost story they had stumbled into. This was real, and it was watching them. Then the TV turned back on. The screen flickered violently, static filling the room. But it wasn't just white noise anymore. It was them. Lena, Mark, and Josh, standing in the motel room just as they were now. But the screen showed something else, something that hadn't happened yet. Mark's head snapped toward Lena. Turn it off. She lunged for the VHS player, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. The screen glitched, the image warping, distorting. Then the tape jumped forward. The closet. The figure. It was moving toward them. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She turned back toward the closet. But the figure was already gone. The motel room was empty. Josh let out a shaky breath. Where? Then, the lights flickered again. Lena turned back to the screen, her pulse hammering in her ears. The video was still playing. Only now it was just static. Lena's stomach twisted as she stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath her feet sounding too loud in the stillness. Josh hesitated before following, his fingers twitching at his sides. Mark was the last to move, his jaw tight, the tape still clutched in his hand. The front door was open. Lena stopped cold. They had locked it before they left. Josh exchanged a look with her. Someone's been here. Mark didn't hesitate. He stepped inside first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Lena followed, her pulse hammering in her ears, her body tense with every step. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of damp wood, but there was something else beneath it now. Something metallic, something wrong. The house felt different. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper. The old furniture sat undisturbed, yet there was a feeling of movement like something had just been there moments before they arrived. Mark led them down the hallway, toward the room from the tapes. The air grew heavier with each step, as if they were walking through something unseen, something pressing against them. The door was still there, and now the names carved into it weren't just on the tape. They were real. Lena reached out, tracing her fingertips over the rough grooves. Her name, Josh's. Mark's. This is impossible, Josh whispered. Mark swallowed hard and reached for the handle. The second he touched it, the static sound filled the air. Not from a TV, not from a tape. It was everywhere surrounding them, making the walls vibrate. The door creaked open on its own. The room beyond was dark, but there was something inside. A faint red glow. The same recording light from the tapes. Lena's breath caught. The camera was sitting on the desk. On. Recording. And then the whisper returned. But this time it wasn't from the closet. It was behind them. Lena spun around, but there was nothing. Just the hallway, stretching endlessly into darkness. Then the floorboards creaked. A shadow shifted at the edge of her vision. Mark grabbed the tape from his pocket and stepped toward the camera. We destroy it. Josh hesitated. What if that's what it wants? Mark didn't answer. He yanked the tape from the VHS player on the desk, snapping the ribbon apart with a harsh pull. The static noise grew louder, the walls trembling. Then the red light blinked out, and everything went still. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Lena realized the house wasn't quiet. It was breathing. A low, rattling inhale filled the room, the walls seemed to pulse with it. The floorboards shuddered beneath their feet. Then the whisper returned. Louder this time. Clearer. Usted eraciet. The door slammed shut behind them. Lena gasped, her hands flying to the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Josh pounded on the wood, his voice shaking. Mark, do something. Mark grabbed the remains of the tape and took a step back, his breath ragged. There's got to be another way. Then the camera flickered back on, and the screen showed them, not as they were now, but as they would be. Their bodies, still, lifeless. The camera had already recorded what was about to happen. Lena felt cold fear wrap around her, stealing the air from her lungs. Josh turned, his face pale. We're not getting out. Mark clenched his jaw. No, we changed the ending. Lena looked at the camera. The tapes had been controlling the story, repeating it, capturing something trapped in time. She stepped forward, grabbed the camera with both hands, and yanked it off the desk. The moment it disconnected, the static stopped. The room went silent. Then the house exhaled. A gust of wind, ice cold, rushed past them, pushing against the walls, rattling the windows. The whisper faded, stretching into nothing. Then the door creaked open. Lena didn't wait. She ran. Josh and Mark followed, their footsteps echoing as they sprinted through the hallway, past the rooms that suddenly seemed smaller, past the shadows that didn't move anymore. The second they burst outside, the weight lifted. The air felt real again, crisp, normal. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. Josh collapsed against the hood, panting. Mark leaned over, hands on his knees, shaking his head. Lena turned back toward the house. It was just a house now. Old, abandoned, still. Mark held up the camera. No light, no sound. Just a broken, empty shell of what it once was. Josh exhaled. It's over. Mark looked at Lena. What do we do with it? Lena stared at the camera in his hands. Then, without a word, she grabbed it and threw it to the ground, stomping it beneath her boot until the plastic cracked, the lens shattered, and the last piece of the story was gone. The house remained silent. Josh let out a weak laugh, running a hand through his hair. No more tapes. Mark nodded, his eyes on the wreckage. No more tapes. Lena exhaled, finally letting herself believe it. The nightmare was over. They never spoke about the tapes again. And when they left that night, they never looked back.